Welcome to AntArctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. British polar explorer Felicity Aston is an author, speaker, expedition leader, and former Antarctic scientist. In 2012, she became the first woman to ski across Antarctica alone. It was a journey of 1,744 kilometers that took 59 days to complete and which gave her a place in the Book of Guinness World Records. Felicity's polar career began in the year 2000 when she traveled to Antarctica for the first time with the British Antarctic Survey as a meteorologist. Aged just 23, she spent a continuous period of 2.5 years, including 2 consecutive winters, at Rothera Research Station on the Antarctic Peninsula to monitor climate and ozone. Felicity went on to organize and lead numerous expeditions to remote places around the world, but particularly to the polar regions. Her expeditions have included the first British women's crossing of Greenland, a 6,000-kilometer drive to the South Pole, and a 36,000-kilometer drive to the Pole of Cold, and leading the largest and most international team of women ever to ski to the South Pole. Felicity continues to explore, specializing in new and exciting ways to communicate the expedition experience to the wider world. Her Kaspersky Lab Commonwealth Antarctic Expedition was the first to tweet to the pole, and material from her Pole of Cold expedition has been developed into a traveling art exhibition. She has written 3 books and regularly produces articles for various publications in the UK and abroad. In 2013, she spent a month flying across North America in an airship, co-presenting a 2-part BBC Science documentary about the atmosphere called Operation Cloud Lab: Secrets of the Skies for BBC Two. And in 2016, she spent a month retracing the route of the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush across the Yukon, co-presenting a documentary miniseries for BBC History. When not on expedition, Felicity has worked closely with a number of expedition-related organizations, sitting on the Council of the Young Explorers Trust and of British Exploring. She currently serves on the Council of the Royal Geographical Society, as well as acting as an ambassador for 2 inspiring charities, the British Antarctic Monument Trust and Equal Adventure. She is also an ambassador for the First Women Project. Felicity has been elected Fellow of both the Royal Geographical Society in London and the Explorers Club in New York. She is a 2008 Churchill Fellow and has received the Ginny Fines Award from the Transglobe Expedition Trust, the 2014 Women of Discovery Award from Wings World Quest, and an honorary doctorate from the Canterbury Christ Church University. In 2015, she was awarded the Queen's Polar Medal, one of the very few women to have received this special honor, and was appointed MBE, or Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, for services to polar exploration. Felicity divides her time between her home in Reykjavik and her native UK. Felicity Aston, welcome to AntArctic Stories.
Thanks very much.
I'm really, really excited to have you on the show today. And as you can see, because we're doing this by video today, I have your Call of the White and I have your Alone in Antarctica, which I just devoured, both of them. Absolutely fascinating for anyone who's interested in this kind of polar expeditioning. I highly recommend them. I also have your Pole of Cold, I believe it's called, upstairs, which my husband took before I could get to it. So you've really turned out a great bunch of reading material about so much of what you've done. None of which, of the ones that I own anyways, have anything to do with the North Pole stuff, which you've also been involved in. So for those of you who aren't aware that are listening, Felicity has taken, actually, I'll maybe let you explain what you've done in the North Pole, because I think you're maybe the most famous for the South Pole stuff. So quick touch on what you've been involved in the North Pole over the past couple of years, or at the North Pole.
Yeah, well, I mean, just, in fact, almost to the day, a year ago, I was trying to ski to the North Pole with a team of women from across Europe and the Middle East. So it was a large and pretty unconventional team of women who were largely novices, had not done anything like this before, and were from places that you might not immediately associate with polar exploration. And in fact, a lot of them were the first person or the first woman from their country to ski to the North Pole or even get to the North Pole, which was really an amazing experience to be part of that, because not only was the team itself a real sort of cultural experiment in terms of women from the West getting to know more about the perspective of women from the Middle East and vice versa, but it was also amazing to see how, you know, those women responded to that environment and how that contrasted perhaps to a European response to that environment. And then afterwards, you know, in the year that's passed since we got there, you know, to see how they've gone back into their home countries and become ambassadors for the Arctic, and greater awareness of the Arctic and why people in the Middle East particularly should care about it. But also the European team members, the same thing, you know, just giving a first-hand experience of a place makes people care about it or think about it a lot more than just watching a news report or something like that. So it's been a really amazing project to be part of.
You know, it's a similar rationale to why those of us who work primarily in the tourism industry, why we think that it's so important to get people up there to actually see it firsthand, because it's very easy not to care about a place if you don't have any physical experience with the place. But once you see it and you feel it, it becomes an inalienable part of who you are, and it changes who you are when you're back home and how you represent that part of the world. So that's really wonderful. And it sounds as though that was sort of let's say a complementary expedition to what you had already done in 2009 when you led the all-women's team to the South Pole. Now, this is what your book Call of the White is about, and you had chosen these women exclusively from Commonwealth countries. And anyone who's read the book, you'll remember that it was seems like quite a painful process to have to go through and interview all these really incredible women and then whittle it down and just choose a few. And many of these women had never seen skis before. Many of them had never experienced sub-zero temperatures. But it's clear that you wanted them to feel like explorers, like they were capable of doing whatever they set their mind to, no matter their background or previous, you know, physical ability. Prior to that expedition, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the first time that you had taken sort of, let's say, novice folks into a polar environment. How many expeditions had you made to the South Pole?
Well, before that expedition in 2009, I'd never skied to the South Pole. My previous experience of Antarctica had been as a meteorologist with the British Antarctic Survey. So straight after university, my first proper job was with the British Antarctic Survey. And back then, you were posted to a research facility, and the UK has two, one Rotherham, which is at the bottom of the Antarctic Peninsula on Adelaide Island, and the second is slightly smaller. It's Halley Research Station, which is on the Brunt Ice Shelf on the Weddell Sea coast. But I was sent to Rotherham, and you know, at the time, your standard contract was 39 months. So you spent a few months at the headquarters in Cambridge in the UK doing training, but then you were sent down to the research station in Antarctica. And the idea is that you completed a summer season, then went straight into a winter season. Then you completed a second summer season, and then a second consecutive winter season, and then a third and final summer season before you came home. So, I mean, I arrived at Rotherham in December of 2000 and didn't leave Antarctica again until April of 2003.
Wow.
So, you know, when you first turn up and see this tiny cluster of buildings and think, okay, you know, I'm not just visiting this. This is not just my place of work. This is going to be my temporary home for, you know, 2.5 years, near enough. You know, that was pretty daunting. But in fact, I think looking back, it's very obvious that that's part of the reason why the polar regions became such a huge part of my life, is because, you know, I got to see Antarctica on days when, you know, it was beautiful and there was nowhere else in the world I would rather be. But I also saw it on days when, quite frankly, I would rather have been anywhere else in the world than down in Antarctica in the dark with a small skeleton crew of people who, you know, at times when you're in a small group dynamic like that, you don't like them very much. You would rather be anywhere else. So it meant that, I got to see Antarctica with all its faces. And then that led me to become really curious and fascinated about what other faces of Antarctica were out there, and wanting to experience those as well.
I can completely relate to that. Obviously, having been down in Antarctica, not on research basis, but down on tourism vessels for a number of years now. However, still, you must get this question of what gave you the idea to do your first hit to ski to the South Pole, bringing a bunch of people along with you that had never, like, it was just so foreign to them. Like, at least you had some Antarctic experience, even if you hadn't done the ski crossing. But did you at any point think, maybe I should try this solo first and see what it's like? Or did you just think, no, we can do this?
Oh, it was a gradual progression. I'm certainly much one of the people in the camp that I served an apprenticeship, but that's what it feels like. So, I spent my time in Antarctica on the research station, but, when you did travel, you traveled in a style that you were trained by the British Antarctic Survey, which was very much heavyweight and belt and braces, taking as little risk as possible. So, you would go out, even if you were just popping out for an afternoon or a night, you would take 30 days food and supplies for 2 people. You would take 2 tents, 2 radios. You would be really heavyweight and slow, but you would be as safe as you possibly could.
Right.
Then after that experience, coming back to the UK from Antarctica, my first thought was to do something totally different. So I swiftly got myself a job in London and started commuting into London every day, becoming a commuter. And it was just horrendous. I realized that, Antarctica is a pretty tough act to follow, and it has huge ability to ruin you for life in one way, is that, you're never going to be able to fit back into that sort of standard everyday mold again. But, so very quickly, I started looking for opportunities to get back into the polar environment, and I ended up heading north, first of all. And I took part in an adventure race. And at the time, it was an annual adventure race to the North Magnetic Pole, or the 1996 position of the North Magnetic Pole. They use the same one every year to make it fun. And so it was a 500-kilometre race from a point called Polaris Island, which was a 5-day ski out of Resolute Bay on Cornwallis Island. And then we choose our own route, racing in independent teams of 3, right the way up to a point just north of Isaacson Mine, to the North Magnetic Pole. And, that was a totally different set of experiences, because we were taught then we were given some training, and we were taught by people who were military, either Norwegian military or British Special Forces, that sort of thing. And their emphasis was all about on travelling fast and light. And that was totally different to the BAS system that I had been taught. So it was about, because it was a race that had out of sight infrastructure, but you still had the support. So if you used your satellite phone to say, we're in trouble, they would be coming over that horizon in a matter of maybe minutes, even though you couldn't see them. And so knowing that there was that backup, it meant that you could really push it, in terms of how much sleep you got, how far and how fast and how hard you were pushing yourself physically and mentally. And so that was a really wonderful and contrasting experience to have to the British Antarctic Survey way of travelling. And that's not necessarily the way I would want to do all my expeditions, in terms of really pushing yourself up to the end of your limits. But I think it gave me a really good foundation, because then I went on to organise my own independent expeditions, and hopefully I sort of tried to strike a balance between that heavyweight, safe way of travelling and the fast and light, sort of more pushing it way of travelling. And so my first independent expedition, was in Greenland. And I went across the Greenland ice sheet with 3 other British women. Yeah, and I tried to sort of strike a middle line, taking the best, as I saw it, of those two ways of travel. And then along the same, I was sort of invited to help people train up novices to go on their own expeditions. So I was sort of being employed for short periods of time as a guide and instructor. And so I was seeing regularly, people that had never done anything like it before, going into this environment and really thriving. And sometimes it was the people you wouldn't expect. There were sort of big, muscular, ex-professional rugby players that were coming in and struggling. And then there were, 59-year-old housewives, small, petite, wiry, that had never done anything like this before, coming in and absolutely kicking ass, and really loving it and thriving on it. And so that gave me this experience of seeing, wow, actually, this isn't about how big your muscles are or what your experience is. It's about where your head is at. And that matched with the experiences, my personal experiences on expedition, when, I'd found the mental side of it so much more challenging necessarily than the physical side of it. And so then I started to put together expeditions going, all sorts of places with all sorts of people. So it was a gradual building of this idea of, I think anybody could do this that has the want to do it. You can come to me and I can give you the fitness, I can give you the skills training, I can give you the confidence. But what I can't give you is the want to do it in the first place. That's what you have to bring with you, the want and the motivation. Everything else, is just a matter of time and training. And so then I thought, okay, let's put this to the test. Let's go out there, put together an expedition of women from random places and, a big mix. And, feeding into this as well was the fact that I was sick and tired of seeing middle-aged, middle-class white men from Northern Europe and America, steaming off into the polar regions and coming back with these tales of stiff upper lips and daring do and all the rest of it. And it was like, I'm sick of this because that's just not the truth that I've experienced. And and so, I guess, putting together this team was also my answer to that, in that, let's see some different faces and some different cultures and some different perspectives out there. Because, the polar regions are not a part of the world that can be looked after by one country, one region, one set of people. It's got to be, a global solution. And there are so many problems in the world today where that is the same, where, it has to be a global solution. It can't just be one set of people that are finding the answer to this. So, it just seemed that it was the right time to put together a project like that.
That's amazing. And for sure, you've created a bunch of ambassadors now who have gone back to countries where a lot of people probably never think about the polar regions, places like Brunei. I mean, it might not even be on their radar. So that's really, really powerful. Going into this whole process of finding these women that you took on this expedition, you were looking for anyone who was basically a native of a Commonwealth country. And I loved, again, in the book, in Call of the White, reading about your process of flying around the world and interviewing applicants and then having to narrow it down to the handful that could come to the training in Norway. And it got even more interesting when you started talking about being out on the ice and talking about sort of the personality management of these people who were from really diverse backgrounds. Different levels of ability to handle pressure, different levels of, to some degree, physical capability. And you wrote about how you really agonized over your own level of communication with each individual member and your own level of support based on what you felt that they need, and kind of always hoping that you were doing the right thing as the expedition leader. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of leadership in that environment and how tough that was in relation to the physical challenges of getting these women to the South Pole?
Expedition environments are always fascinating ones for team dynamics and interpersonal psychology, really. And I think it's because when you take someone out of their normal environment, particularly the polar environments, which are so empty of all the material things that we hide behind in our normal lives, you're all wearing the same clothes, no one's driving a car, you're all eating the same food, you're all facing the same challenges. And then at the same time, everyone feels very vulnerable. You're a long way from home. You're often tired or hungry or uncomfortable in some way. You're going into uncertainty, and that knocks a lot of people off balance. Is just the general uncertainty in terms of, they don't know what to expect, but also once you're there, traveling around in the polar regions is nature reigns supreme. You can never say, oh, we will be doing this on this day at this time, because the environment around you has the last say. And, that tends to clash with our normal experience in modern life, where increasingly things are scheduled and reliable. And that can't be underestimated in terms of how much that knocks people off balance. And so the result is that on expeditions, I believe that you very quickly get to see people strip back. You see what they're really made of. You'll see them in the raw. And one thing that I'm very grateful for is that more often that has allowed me to see how brilliant people are. More often people astound you by just how fantastic they are and how human beings are capable of such amazing compassion and altruism, just little things that, you see on expeditions, like, somebody notices that someone else is having a tough day and gives them their extra ration of chocolate or something to cheer them up, even though you know that they must be desperate to rip into that chocolate bar themselves, or, just little things like that you just think, that is amazing. And I guess that's what leads me to question myself, in terms of when you see someone being amazing in that way, it makes me instantly think, gosh, am I doing enough? Am I doing that? Am I noticing the people around me enough? And am I noticing their needs? And am I being supportive enough to my team members and things like that? And I think that's amplified when you're then in a leadership position, because you feel responsibility. I see it as my job when I'm in charge to make sure that everyone is in a position to be able to be performing at their best and doing their best. And if they're not, if they're, injured or ill or unhappy, then I see that as my personal failure, that I haven't given them the right environment and the right support to be in a really good place. And it's interesting how, I battle a lot with, I'm asked for my views on things in terms of leadership and team management, and I'm asked for advice by people, and it always makes me feel a little uncomfortable, because I am by no means flawless at this. I know people that I've worked for that have led me, that I think have got this in a lot better place than I am, and perhaps it's good to be reminded of that occasionally. So, for example, the expedition that I led to the North Pole, I didn't get everything right, and I wasn't at the top of my game. And, I've spent a large part of the last year kind of going over that in my own mind and thinking, okay, what did I let slip? What could I have done better? What was my role in these things that didn't happen as well as they could have done? And, to start off with, I was myself up about that a bit, like, I didn't do this right and I didn't do that right. And it's only really now, about a year later, that I'm starting to see why I should be grateful for that experience, that actually, a period of learning and reflection is great, but then you have to let go of it, not beat yourself up about it, and just move forward. And kind of that's where I'm at now. And now I'm starting to be grateful for that experience in terms of, I think it's very easy when you've been doing this for a number of years, and I've been leading polar expeditions for 20 years now, just over. And it's easy to become complacent and to think, okay, if I do it in the same way every time, the results will be equally successful. And that's not the case. I'm a different, changing person, and each team I lead is different and unique in its own way, and needs to be managed, if you like. I mean, I don't mean that to their detriment. I mean, your role in terms of making that team the best it can be has to change depending on the group that is there and where you are at in your own life as well when that happens. So I think the key to it is to try and keep yourself fresh, I suppose, in terms of being very aware of the needs of this particular group of people. And also being aware that you always have to remain open to different ways of doing things to make sure that you stay at the top of your game.
Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the next big expedition that you did in Antarctica after you did the Commonwealth Women's Trip in 2009. In 2012, you undertook an expedition to cross the entire continent alone. And for, I have your book here, Alone in Antarctica, which is very aptly named. And for those who haven't read your book, can you talk a little bit about that feeling of being unutterably alone on Earth's most inhospitable continent? Because we could have a whole podcast episode about this alone, but I just kind of want to get a snapshot of what that experience was like. Maybe you can let us know what you really loved about it and also what you really hated about it, because there's so few people who would ever experience something like that.
The expedition really was born on curiosity. By then I'd skied to the South Pole. I'd been on vehicle convoys to the South Pole. I'd, traveled around Antarctica in various different ways and for different reasons. And, so I was familiar with the way the Antarctic landscape really sort of gets into your brain and gets into your responses, and and influences you as a person. And so I was really curious about how I would react and respond to that environment if I was on my own, even to the point where I remember on days when it was when I was skiing to the pole with the team, when it was my turn to be out front of the group navigating, I would try and imagine that they weren't there, that I was out there on my own, that if I turned around, there would be nothing there, just a copy of the view that I had in front of me, and trying to really, picture that scenario and make it real for myself, so I could try and judge what my reaction might be. But until you do it for real, you never really know. And it's interesting how I thought I had prepared really well for that expedition. I'd been to see sports psychologists that specialized in theories of aloneness and things like that, and they taught me all sorts of tools and techniques, and talked to lots of people that had been solo before, and what their experiences were. And yet in the first few minutes of being dropped off by the plane on the Ross Ice Shelf coast of Antarctica, it just dawned on me that I really hadn't prepared at all. And it was because I had no concept of how it was going to feel. And when I talk about this expedition, I try and describe those first few moments about how terrifying it felt, truly terrifying. Mm-hmm. It was sort of a shock of aloneness, when the plane flew away and I was on my own for the first time. And I was looking at that landscape and the vastness of that landscape and realizing that there was no other human being in it. And then in the days that followed, as I worked my way up through the Transantarctic Mountains, and I was traveling on a very sort of narrow, steep glacier. And I thought, there's just no way a plane could land here on this glacier. It's too steep, too windy, too narrow. And then I thought, well, that's a good distance either side of this glacier. I would have to get myself in order to get to a point where a plane could come in. And this was on the back of the experience of knowing that it had taken them a week of logistical, backgammon to get the fuel depots and things in the right places, and the planes available to piggyback me all the way across the continent to the start point. So, I was aware that even if I, used my sat phone to ring for help, it wasn't going to be an easy task for them to come and get me. And when you realize, or when I realized just how responsible I was for my own well-being, there was a very thin safety net with quite a few big holes in it. And, that really hit me like a bit of a psychological freight train. Yeah. Just being responsible for myself for the first time. And it sounds so, ridiculous, really, that would have such a scary impact. But it really did, just realizing that there was no one going to come over that horizon to save me. I had to get myself out of any trouble I got myself into. And, and struggling with that pretty much through the whole expedition. People often ask me, how did you combat that fear? How did you get over it? And I was like, well, I don't think I ever really did. It was a constant level of fear that sometimes came closer to the surface, and other times I was more successful at kind of pushing it to the back of my mind. But it was always there, ready to pop back out again. And I had to be constantly sort of vigilant in terms of trying to manage that. Yeah. And, one of the times when it was most scary was actually about 10 days before I finished the expedition. I knew I was near a big area of crevassing, and it was really bad weather. So I knew I wouldn't be able to see anything, that there wouldn't really be any warning signs. And crevasses were really what frightened me, being out there on my own. That was the real big danger. So I'm sitting in my tent sort of contemplating the next day I've got to get out and, carry on. And for some reason I got it in my head that I needed to get out and find a way forward. So I sort of rushed out of my tent, and I'm kind of rushing around. I'm just in my tent booties, and I slapped on my sort of Gore-Tex over my thermals, but that was it. And I'm rushing around. And then just suddenly I snapped out of it, as if I'd sort of gone delirious for a period of time. I snapped out of it, and I turned round, and my tent was just this tiny little black blob in the distance. I'd gone far from my tent. I had nothing on me apart from I had my satellite phone in my pocket, but I'm like, I've got no GPS here or anything. And it was really bad weather. I thought, if I lose sight of this tent, this is horrendous. It was the shock of me realizing that I'd done something so stupid. It was like I'd suddenly lost my mind temporarily, and that really scared me. It was like, whoa, this is. I've always been someone known for having a lot of common sense, being very sensible, very, conservative almost in my decision making. And here I was, badly dressed,
running around.
Really. And then finally, the final was, I realized that I'd left my stove on in my tent. I just dashed out the tent with my stove still going inside my tent. And it was like, what am I doing? And I rushed back to that tent like you wouldn't believe. And it was all fine. But, it left me sitting there almost trembling at just how stupid and ridiculous and out of character that had been. And so, having experiences like that are really scary. And, keeping that level of fear down so that my thought processes were as logical as they could be, and so that I could rely on my own brain was, my number one priority really for a lot of that.
It's so interesting that you've gone through that experience of being alone for so long in an environment where you don't have very many external cues. There's no infrastructure, there's no people to interact with. And then doing things like that are out of character and having that experience of sort of momentarily kind of losing it and running out and thinking about other things. And it's so incredibly fascinating. And I did hear in another interview that you had done as well, that you talked about how you realized that who you thought you were, maybe wasn't quite that, but rather you realize being alone, that in your regular life, who you are as Felicity is actually very much tempered by who you have around you at any given time. So I might be getting that a little bit wrong. Perhaps you could explain it a little bit better than I just did. But I thought that was also a really fascinating element of being alone by yourself for so long and having that realization about who you are as an individual, as a personality, as a human soul.
It was really striking to me in terms of going from team expeditions to suddenly being out there on my own, is that I was sort of the best possible version of myself when I was in a leadership role, and I was very conscious of the need to do that. I guess you'd say, I was conscious of the need that often teams need to see the leader that they need rather than who you naturally are. And you have to be quite conscious, I think, of the person that you are presenting to the team. And I'm not talking about being, someone who spins lies or, is overly confident or pretends to be someone else. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about being the best version of yourself and being conscious of the fact that you need to be the best version of yourself. But there's also part of it that comes very naturally and that everyone experiences. If you're in a tent with 3 other people, you have to be out of your sleeping bag on time. You have to be doing, completing the chores and the roles that are yours to do. Otherwise, you are very instantly letting others down and in a very important way. But when you're on your own, that immediacy of discipline disappears. And suddenly you've got to be the best version of yourself for you rather than for others. And it really showed me how, certainly me personally, how I thrive on those relationships around me, and how that kind of feeling of not letting others down is a really important part of my own motivation and my own, where I source my sense of determination from. A lot of that is, I've got to be the best I can be for the people around me, and and to fulfill their expectations and what they need me to be and things like that. And when you're on your own, suddenly, for example, suddenly there's this little devil on your shoulder that is never there when you're traveling with other people. There's a little devil on your shoulder that 24/7 is giving you bad advice, is saying, you could pitch your tent now, nobody would know. You can just say it's bad weather and just pitch the tent. You don't have to get out your sleeping bag. Who's going to know? Sleep in for a couple of hours, that sort of thing. All the time, constantly, blah, 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 on your shoulder. And you have to expend a lot of energy in shutting that voice up and going, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue with my plan. I'm going to, keep this self-discipline. I'm going to not take the shortcut. And that was a expenditure of energy that was never a factor when I was out there with the team, because it's simply not a question. It's not a possibility to do those things. So, and that was something that I hadn't planned for, I guess, was that it would be a lot harder to be the version of myself I needed to be when I was out there on my own. But I think the interview that you're referring to was that I was talking a little bit about how being alone affected me as a person, and in a surprising way. So it affected, for example, the way I expressed myself, the way I made decisions, just these sorts of things that didn't necessarily come to mind before I left on the expedition. And so when I went out to Antarctica, I had assumed that I was intrinsically my character, that there were strains in my character that were intrinsically me and had been from, the day I was born, and this is Felicity. So I was kind of like a gingerbread cutout of myself, essentially. That was core me. But I realised when I went out to Antarctica on my own and, really, that's a relatively short period of time, 2 months to be on my own. Just in that short period of time, relatively, that gingerbread cutout that I thought was me just started ballooning out in all sorts of ways, until it was just this mushy, spongy mess that I couldn't really get a grab hold of. It was like, who on earth am I? I don't know who I am anymore. I'm suddenly sort of an over-emotional, sort of euphoric 1 minute, desperately sad the next minute person, just bleeding all over the place. And so I realised that actually Felicity, the core character of me, is more like the spaces between the people I surround myself with. And I just really began to appreciate what an influence the people around us have on who we are, and just how chameleon we are as human beings, or certainly I am, in terms of shaping myself to fit the people around me. And so that led on to the thought that I have to be really careful about the people I choose to have in my life and the people I choose to have relationships of one form or another with, because that has a real impact on who I end up being and the character I am. So that was something unexpected as well, that only became apparent afterwards.
That's so interesting to hear. And I imagine there are a number of other things that you could have never anticipated going across Antarctica alone, these amazing learnings and whatnot. But speaking of sort of who you are and who you think you are, I did also hear you talk about the fact that growing up, you weren't really big into sports. You weren't a tomboy. And, sometimes you would even come up with excuses to skip Phys Ed class. So rather than ask you the sort of typical question of why was Antarctica the goal? Why cross Antarctica? I'm much more keen to know, when was it that you realized that long endurance challenges were so appealing? And I suppose another way of putting that would be, when was this unstoppable explorer born in you?
I think really central to this question is the fact that for me, the place itself is the motivation. Mm-hmm. It's never been about the physical goals, if you like. I'm not someone that enjoys going to the gym. I don't relish the idea of suffering for suffering's sake. I'm not someone that's just going to keep going and doing longer and longer trips for the interest of proving that you can do that. For me, it's always about seeing the place and the place itself that grabs my curiosity, and that is the motivation, and that's also what gives me the drive to do it. In crossing Antarctica from one coast to the other as I saw it, and to do that alone, for me, without wanting to sound too pretentious, this was nothing about conquering or achieving, or it was more about wanting to see this place almost in thanks for this place existing. It was kind of a homage, if you like. Again, I sound like I'm going into real pretension territory here, but for me, it was very much done in the spirit of homage rather than conquering. I'm in total awe of Antarctica as a place, and of our planet as a place. It's this fantastic miracle that it's here. And so for me, just having the experience of seeing an entire cross section of that continent, that was the real goal for me. That was the thing that drove me forward. And so the fitness, the endurance, the physical ability to do it is more a means to an end for me. You have to be at a certain fitness level to be able to do it and complete it and do it successfully. And so I set out to get what I needed in order to make that journey, but not for its own sake. So I'm not likely to become an ultra marathon runner anytime soon, unless that ultra marathon happens to be in a place that I really want to see. So, for example, quite a few years ago now, I ran the Marathon des Sables, and that was more about curiosity to see. In case you don't, the Marathon des Sables is, I think it's 250 kilometers that you run in over about 5 days, and that for me was not about proving that I could do that physically. It was about seeing that environment, because you run through the night at times as well. And, and I was just really intrigued to have that experience of that environment and to do that. So it's always curiosity about the place and about having the experience itself rather than the fitness or the endurance or anything like that.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that nothing is terribly boring, or nothing gets terribly boring when you're that curiosity driven. There's always something else to go see and go explore.
Well, I don't know. As much as I love the Antarctic environment, and it's awesome and wonderful and full of surprises and full of colour and full of things to see and experience, battling that sense of monotony is one of the challenges, I think, of doing a long ski journey in the polar environment, But then, you get to love that. You get to love that sense of being in some kind of deep meditation, It's because you hear your own breathing and the rhythm of you skiing, and you kind of have this time and space to think. And it's amazing how often in our normal lives we don't get time to do that. And I often go and talk to people about the experience of being alone, and one of the questions I ask is, have you ever been alone, in terms of being somewhere where there is not another sign of another human being for as far as you can see? And a lot of people have, but for very brief periods of time and not very often. So maybe they've gone for a hike during the day and not seen anyone else, or maybe they've gone to a retreat in an isolated cottage in a remote part of the country for a weekend or something. But, there's a lot of adults out there that have never, ever spent any time alone in their adult life. And I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? Doesn't it just show how we are hardwired and designed as human beings to be social animals, to be surrounded by our tribe? And I think maybe a lot of interesting things would come out of more people spending dedicated time alone, and just to see what comes out the other side of that. I think that would be very interesting.
I think so too, especially because when you're that alone, you can't escape your thoughts. When you're around other people and the distractions of modern life, you can absolutely ignore those deeper thoughts and ideas and stuff. But when you're alone, you're stuck with it. That hamster wheel is going to get going. And that's an interesting place to go as well, if you've never actually had the space to do that.
Yeah. And also deciding where you're going next. I mean, we talked about being goal driven and goal orientated. And I think in order to do that, you need to have the time to stop and think what it is you really want to do next.
Yeah.
I mean, I've fallen into this pit myself, is that, you sort of get on a treadmill of the next trip, the next expedition, the next opportunity, which is all great. It's great that these things are coming your way. But, I also try and remind myself to make time to stop and really think about, where is it I want to go? What is it I want to do next? What is it that in 40 years' time, if I'm lucky enough to still be around then, will I look back and think, I'm so proud that I did that, and I'm so pleased I did that? And we were talking earlier about the Commonwealth expedition and why particularly that plan and that trip. And that was largely due to the fact that, I had had a lot of long ski journeys previous to that, and that had being time to think about, okay, what was it I really wanted to do? What did I think would be a really good use of my time to address a subject that I really cared about? And, and that takes time to isolate. What is it you care about? What is the cause you want to contribute to? What is the goal you want to set yourself? So, I try still to remind myself to take the time out to do that, because it's too easy to let life just carry you forward, I think, without really giving it direction.
That's very true. And when you think about it, the expeditions you've done and you've given a lot of thought to pulling together, like the Commonwealth expedition, ultimately that's going to be a part of your legacy, right? I mean, you've given all this great thought, and you've pulled together expeditions that are extremely noteworthy and are, the first time being done. And that's really Felicity Aston's legacy work, so it's quite a strong endorsement for spending that time to really think about what contribution do you want to make? What what do you want to be remembered for when you're gone, without sounding too morbid.
Yeah, but it also applies to, when the expedition is over, it's very easy to just immediately move on to the next one or the next trip or the next goal or whatever it is. And I think it's really important to put aside the time to make that expedition work, because actually doing the expedition itself is only half of the project. Spreading the message that you wanted to send, or underscoring the positive message that you wanted to send from that expedition, that takes time and effort afterwards, and that's as important as doing the trip itself. And so when I was in my sort of late 20s, I was on this kind of treadmill, and I made myself, after the next trip, you are going to stop, and for the year after that, you're going to write about it and talk about it and make sure that the message of this project and the greater part of this project actually is embedded and happens. And so, because before you've even finished a trip, people will be asking you what next, and it's really hard not to let that be a brainworm. What next, and to feel pressured into, okay, I need to have the next project already lined up. I need to be doing something next. And it's the one thing that has kind of got under my skin over the years is when people say what next, it's like, how about talking about what you're doing or what you've just done, and let alone what's next. Why does there have to be a what next? Why can this not be enough in itself? But I think it's really important to spend the time, because that part after the trip is in many respects the most important part of the project. How you spread the story of that, how you create the results of that, and that's where the real point of you doing it lies. And so you need to spend the time doing that, I think.
So your actual professional title is explorer, correct?
Yeah, it's funny because, the whole kind of adventure, polar, whatever community kind of went through some identity crisis where everyone started giving themselves titles like extreme athletes and adventurers and all sorts of things, and that's all great. Whatever works for you, I think is brilliant. But I found personally that people just looked at me confused when I used anything else. If you say to someone, I'm a polar explorer, they basically, in 2 words, have got the essence of what you do. Oh, you go on ski journeys to cold places. And so just for simplicity and ease more than anything else, I stick with polar explorer or explorer, and everyone kind of gets the gist of what you do.
That's great. I love it. It sounds so cool, but you're right. It's an exact representation of what it is that you do. And I know, based on what you had talked about in Call of the White, when you were planning that trip, and this is now going back, 12, 13 years during the planning phase anyways, it was really tough because you had to sort of self-fund going around the world to do interviews and whatnot. And you were maxing out your credit cards and that kind of thing. So it was a real labor of love. And there were a lot of financial hurdles before you had got the sponsorship in place for the actual expedition itself. So now, where you're at now, and you're so much more well known, and you're an air quotes explorer with so many successful expeditions under your belt, what does that mean for you career-wise? Like, is it easier now? Have more doors opened for you, or do they open more easily for you, given what you've accomplished over the past 10 to 15 years?
You would like to think so, wouldn't you? You'd like to think that sort of greater credibility, which I think is the important part of it, greater credibility, and being able to say, oh, this has happened and that has happened, and it happened with this level of success or that level of success or whatever. You would hope that would make it easier, but I mean, my personal experience is that I still have to fight just as hard now as I did 20 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
In all respects, in terms of finding funding, of being taken seriously, all sorts of things. And that's within the community as well as without of the community. And I mean, and I don't think I help myself because for a start, the idea that this is a career, I find quite hilarious. Anyway, it's certainly, I got asked just the other day, when did you decide to be an explorer? And I was like, oh my goodness, I don't think I ever did. It's just kind of sort of happened and evolved. And now looking back on it, it also, every step seems to have followed a very obvious path and brought me here. But, at the time when you're going through it, you can't see that. And, that's not obvious. And Yeah, so it's still just as hard now. And for example, there's an expedition I would really love to do, and not in the polar regions, in a different part of the world, but kind of connected. I've been out there looking for funding, and it's not something that's probably going to attract corporate sponsorship or something like that. So I've been looking for grants, and there's very few pots of money out there for something that crosses disciplines or that is a little esoteric, that doesn't neatly fit into a box of climbing an unclimbed peak or reaching a unreached pole, and so it's really hard. And I'm waiting for funding decisions now, and it probably looks like it's not going to happen this year. I'm still hoping that it'll happen next year, but it's still just as hard, and it's all just a sort of hustle to get out there and to make things happen. And it kind of annoys me a little bit within the industry when people, I guess, like me, that go out there and find corporate sponsorship to make funds happen, sort of get mocked a little bit by people that the majority of their work comes through sort of paid guiding and things like that. At various points I've sort of had eyes rolled and things like, here you go off and do some more corporate talks and things like that. And it's like, well, it's making it happen, and it's so difficult to make these things happen, and particularly if it's not the sort of thing where you can get the tourist buck involved in it, when it's a bit more exploratory. It's hard to find the money, and I think making it happen is the thing that I admire others most for. People out there in the industry that are still making stuff happen. And I can really appreciate just how much energy it takes. And for me, I find that requires the greatest proportion of motivation. Is the getting back out there, knocking on more doors, that type of thing. If it was a matter of opening up a catalogue and choosing something, I'd be out there every year. It's finding the energy to get back out there again on what will be exactly the same challenge of a road. That's the hard bit for me. And that's why I have to be very careful about what projects I choose, I think, and why I take so much time over choosing it, because it's got to be a project that is going to keep me motivated and driven over 2-3 years to make it happen.
Right.
And I think it's very easy to kind of get deflated and think, I just can't put myself through that again. But give it some time. And so another idea comes along that just won't leave you alone, and you're like, against my better judgment, I'm now out here announcing I'm going to be doing this or doing that, and I'm out there trying to find the money to make it happen. So glutton for punishment maybe, but the rewards are so brilliant. It's such a high, isn't it, when you manage to pull something off?
For sure. And it's also, you can't totally escape it, can you? Because it's like, once it's like we say, the polar, you catch the polar bug. Once you've got it, or the travel bug or whatever bug, some things, once it's kind of under your skin, you can't escape it anymore. And the reality is, I think, for many of us who don't function within a normal 9-to-5 working world, is, I would imagine in your case, it's like, well, I can keep going and try to put together these great expeditions, which is where my heart lies and where I thrive the most. Or I could right? Like, what's the alternative? And I know there's other ways to make a living than go back to a job, but it's so much. It sounds like it's so fundamentally a part of who you are. And the other options just feel maybe not as, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, with me, certainly it hasn't ever been as clear cut as that. I've kind of... back in my 20s, I worked with and, had friendships with women who were older than me, sort of, so they were in their late 40s, early 50s, who were, going out on expeditions and still very active. But I got the sense that perhaps they didn't want to be particularly, that it had become what do they call it, sort of golden handcuffs, I suppose. It was, they were out there because they didn't really know how to do anything else, or perhaps that sounds a little unkind, or because they needed to. And also with the family side of things, this is a tough thing to keep doing and having a family. And I felt that I needed to deliberately work on that to make sure that I did have a plan B, that I did have another reason for being, that I did have another, that expeditions weren't the sole focus of my life and my sole purpose in life, because I'd kind of seen how that could be a negative as well as a positive. And I made the decision, like most women, I think, in the world, at some point you have to make the decision, am I going to be a mother or not? And I think whichever decision you make is absolutely fine. Of course it is. But I think you have to make that decision. Again, one or two of these women that I knew early on, they didn't have children, but that was never a decision they'd made. Just suddenly they found themselves in their 50s and it had never happened. Yeah. And I thought, okay, for me, that's not the way I want this to play out. I want to have made the decision, either yes or no, but, whichever. And, I know there's lots of situations in life. Sometimes you make a decision and then it turns out you don't have that decision to make. It doesn't happen for all sorts of reasons. But, and so with the exploring and similarly, I wanted to create a life outside of this that meant as much to me and gave me as much. And that's a constant battle. I think I'm not alone in realizing the own contrariness of my own psyche. When I'm out on expedition, I'm thinking regularly about, I wish I was back home on my sofa with a big glass of wine, watching a movie, cuddled up to my loved one. And then when you're at home with that exact scenario, you're staring out the window thinking, God, I want to be out on those mountains right now. What am I doing here? I need to be out there. And so, making those two parts of your life harmonize and balance each other rather than pull each other apart and you in the process, that's hard work. I don't have all the answers, but I've really deliberately and consciously worked hard to make sure that I don't fall into what I've seen being negative for other people, which is that you end up being in your 50s or 60s or whatever and going out on expeditions not because you want to, but because you feel you have to, being compelled to do it rather than because it's something you really want to do, and won't forgive yourself if you don't.
And also because it's the way you've been operating for so long, you don't know what you would do if you weren't doing that. That's something I see often with the polar guides that I know who just stay in it and they don't sort of put down any roots or have any long-term relationships back home aside from their primary family members. And so they just stick with it. And then, as you say, before you know it, you're in your 40s or 50s and you're like, well, what would I do if I wasn't doing this kind of polar guiding? I can't go and get an office job. I don't want to be at home all the time. It's kind of an addictive, it's a real challenge. I don't think there's one answer, but it's like so many people go through that, right?
Exactly. And I want to, there are other people that I know right now and their roots, their family, their bonded kind of life experience is out in these seasonal situation, that those people are their family, that is their roots, and that really works for them. And as you've just said, there is no one answer. There's different things work for different people, and there is no right or wrong. There's nothing that's better than something else. But I think it is worth making sure that these are conscious decisions rather than I think one way of making sure that you don't end up on the wrong side of it all is thinking about it and thinking, well, is this what I want? And if it isn't what you want, then change it. I think it's a bad thing, particularly in the guiding industry, because we've all had this experience where you've met or worked with someone who is doing it because they feel they have to and not because they want to. And it doesn't make them good at their job. If you are sort of cynical and a bit kind of bored, that's not a great experience for the people that you're leading or the people that you're guiding. And I don't think it makes you particularly open to new and fresh and exciting things. And then you've got to ask, well, what's the point then? So, I think, just making sure that you are where you want to be. That's I guess, the core of the point I'm making. And recognizing that there is no right answer. The other thing that really gets under my skin is, people who judge others for the decisions they've made, be it that they are going to be working away from a traditional home, or that they're staying at home for a while, or that's great. If that works for them, that's brilliant. And they don't need to be sort of snided at for that.
Absolutely,
there is no right answer. But
I love your point of just really at the core of it all is being intentional about your choices, making sure that at every step you're being intentional about your choices so that you build the life that you want, not just the life that happened by default while you were busy doing other things. So, yeah, and this kind of actually leads really nicely into my next question, which is a bit of a random one, but it piqued my interest because I'm half Icelandic myself. And I know through a mutual friend of ours that you met your husband when the two of you and one other Icelandic gentleman were driving a convoy to the South Pole, supporting another expedition. And you now live in Reykjavik, which as soon as I heard that, I was like, what? Amazing. So you're there with your husband and son. And I'm very curious, given your background, your busy lifestyle, leading expeditions, planning expeditions. And then also, of course, like your close ties to the UK where you're from. You're obviously very close to your family from what I've read in your books. How has it been for you to integrate into Icelandic life, especially given that the language is so dramatically different?
You're right about the language. In order to feel totally at home in Iceland, you have to know the language. The language is so much of the culture here and a sense of belonging. And, the idea of foreignness is all about, whether you speak Icelandic or not. If you speak Icelandic, then you are Icelandic. That's the bottom line. And if you don't, then you're not. And so the language is something I'm still battling with. I've been here 6 years now, and I'm trying to get by, but I'm by no means fluent. And it's a tough. I think I'm not just saying that to give myself an excuse. It is a pretty tough language, particularly for English speakers. For a start, they have a sort of th noise. They have a rolled R, and then they have this sort of Welsh double L. It's like it was very guttural at the back. And if you get a and in the same word, it's just it's just impossible. But and it's not impossible. I shouldn't be saying that. It's not impossible. It's definitely possible. It's just I'm still working on it. Iceland was somewhere where, apart from the language, I immediately sort of felt at home. And I met Icelanders first. So I sort of met and worked with Icelanders in Antarctica. Yeah. And it was their kind of attitude towards things and their perspective, their very matter-of-factness and their kind of resilience, I suppose, that I just really admired. And their sense that, you go out there and you explore life, and their connection to Iceland is phenomenal. Yeah, so that convoy that you referred to, it was me and two Icelanders, one of which is my husband, and the other one is now godson to my child. So it's a godfather to my son, rather.
Nice.
So it was a pretty influential, fundamental expedition to go on. But then, we spent 6 weeks, just the three of us in two vehicles. So you're either going to love them or hate them by the end of that, I think, by the end of that experience. And it was a pretty intense expedition. There was, a lot of quite dodgy things in terms of, what we were doing and the hazards that we were facing. Yeah. And so, it was pretty, it was a pretty intense time that we spent together. But living here in Iceland, it feels to me, I'm still very connected to the UK, and it kind of feels to me like Iceland as a country is a very northern, strange town of the UK. I'm lucky that it's only 3 hours flying, and I fly backwards and forwards a lot, and it kind of just feels like I'm flying to a very northern town in the UK. And but again, it's taken me by surprise just how culturally different Iceland is. Yeah. You tend to think, we're all just Northern Europeans, so we must think along the same lines. And the longer I live here, the more I realise that no, Icelanders are a very special subset, as are the British. And being outside your home country, I think, always highlights the eccentricities of your own culture and just how affected we are as individuals by our own culture. I largely thought, I'm Felicity, and I'm British, but that doesn't really make any difference to the way I do things or the way I think. And the more I've lived outside of the UK, the more I've realised, no, there are things that I do. I think, why do I think, why is that important to me? Or why do I feel strongly about this? And it's like, because, I've grown up with this being a really, key thing that's talked about all the time. So but it's I love being here. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to spend a lot of time, and I feel very lucky.
Fantastic. Yeah, Iceland, well, obviously it has a very special place in my heart, and so it's not every day you meet someone who comes from outside of Iceland moving into Iceland. So it's a really neat thing to hear your perspective on being there and integrating, and best of luck learning the language. I've tried as well and failed miserably, but hopefully you're actually living there, which makes a big difference. So Felicity, what is next on the horizon for you? Is there anything that you're at liberty to talk about in terms of potential next expeditions?
Well, I'm going away on a small trip rather than an expedition just next month. We're going up to northern Ethiopia, which again is somewhere different for me, but into a sort of mountain community up there on a community trekking project. Further away than that, I've still got a list as long as my arm of projects and journeys that I would love to make happen, but it's just a matter of finding the funding and finding the right people too to do that with. So they're all in various stages of reality. And I hate talking about things before I know they will actually happen, because I hate that. I don't want to be a person that's always talking about these things that never happen. So I tend to sort of keep them close to my chest until I know they are definitely going to happen at one point or another, and then I can talk about them. But we're still very much also processing the results of the expedition last year to the North Pole. There was a film crew with us, so they are now editing together the footage that they shot to put together a film that we were all desperate to see. We've seen little snippets of the footage, and it's just phenomenal to see the quality of the sort of visual experience that they've recorded. Because when you experience something for real, you think there's no way that this can be reproduced in film. But from the snippets that I've seen, it just brings back that sense of the cold and the anxiety and the stress and the just wonder and beauty of it as well. So we're really looking forward to seeing the film come out of that, and we're busy writing about it as well, which we're trying to put together a book that is written by all of us, which if you've ever tried to do anything by committee, you can imagine how difficult it is to try and get 10 different people to write about their experiences and then to pitch that together in a way that works. So we're still working on that, and might be for quite some time. But yes, so lots of different projects and lots of different stages of reality right now. But
Oh, that's great. That's really exciting. Well, is there anything like a cause or a project or initiative that you want to give a shout out to, just as we're wrapping up?
Oh gosh. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. There's nothing that I'm actively involved in at the moment, but come and join me on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, because at the moment, what's been working really well for me is just saying, hey, there's this trip I really want to do. Is there anybody out there that wants to do this with me? And I've been putting together teams of people just through Facebook and social media and Twitter and things like that. And it's been working really well. And we went out to Zanskar in January, which is in northern India, in Ladakh. And there's a few more on the horizon. So come join me on social media, particularly if you fancy doing some weird and wonderful trip at some point in the future with a bunch of strangers that you only know through Facebook.
I love it. That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Felicity. This has been fascinating. I wish we had many more hours to talk about so many more of your adventures, but it will have to do for now. And hopefully we will have another opportunity to have you back on Antarctic Stories in the future. But thank you again.
Wonderful. I look forward to it. Thanks very much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. If you like the stories we bring to you, please subscribe for future episodes. And if you want to help the podcast, leaving a rating or review greatly assists us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions. your experts in small ship expedition cruises to the Arctic and Antarctica. We love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.